2011s are cool guns. They're kind of mythologized on how they started to kind of what they are today. Like, they used to need a lot more looking after than a regular gun, and today that's not so much the case. So we're going to talk about maintaining a high burn 2011, some tips and tricks to make life easier, some pitfalls to look out for, and the parts you need to keep an eye on. So real quickly, I want to give a quick shout out to my Patreon subscribers because I asked them what videos they want to see, and this was the video they voted for as the #1 pick. So here we are. Those guys are awesome. Thank you guys. I've competed with 2011 style guns for the past 5 years. In a light year, putting between about 10,000 to 15,000 rounds. In heavier years, going between 15 to as much as maybe 25. All guns aren't going to require the same maintenance. Some guns that are going to be a lot tighter fit, like the Gunsmith guns, are going to require stuff different from, you know, your typical production 2011 style guns. But we'll kind of talk about what I do. So generally speaking, a 2011 style gun can make it up to about 1,000 rounds reliably and safely, like every single time, assuming that shooting is in a short enough window, because oil doesn't necessarily just stay on your gun when not in use. Some oil will evaporate, some will run out. If you point a gun down, the oil will run out the front of the gun. So the oil does need to be on the gun, generally speaking, to get it to work. So the time between oilings is material, but generally speaking, if you're shooting all the time, you can go about 1,000 rounds in a 4 to 6 week period with a single oiling application. And here's your first pro tip. If you simply just reapply oil, you can go a lot further without having to clean the gun. However, if you've got an internal extractor like this Bull Armory Tac Pro does, you're going to eventually need to clean it because there will be buildup that requires attention. So there's that to consider. The kind of oil that you use is completely up to you. There's not like a best one, and they're all kind of samey in how they function. There are two general types. There is the like lubrication type that has to be on the gun to get it to work. And then there's more of the surface treatment type, which is the kind that I tend to use because it kept my open guns running well. Like, that sounds like witchcraft, but what it amounts to is if you've got a cast iron skillet, you know how you season it and you polymerize an oil on the skillet and then the surface is like super non-stick? It's the same concept, but applied to pistols. True Blue's website does a better job talking about how the lubrication process polymerizes and allows it to be more kind of non-stick, if you will. But generally speaking, you're gonna want a light oil and not a grease. You can use grease when you're oiling the guns, but only use it on the locking lugs for the barrel and the slide. The grease stays put a little bit better, but it doesn't work in cold temperature ranges. I've seen plenty of dudes have guns choke in cold weather when their oiled isn't up to the task. So I'll show you how I go through cleaning the guns. So first things first, we are in the blood lead levels management game if you make shooting as a hobby. So you're gonna wear some nitrile gloves. That's right, and you're gonna use a cleaning mat, and you're gonna throw your cleaning mat away when it gets too disgusting because all the lead and stuff inside your gun is now on that mat, and the whole point is to not let that into your body. So throw them away when they get gross. So first things first, on 2011, you're gonna pull the slide to the rear to get the little half moon cut out over the lug on the slide release, pushing on the other side of the slide release till the slide release kind of pops out and locks the slide up, pull the slide release out, and then take the slide assembly off the gun. Next step is going to be removing the guide rod. Depending on the guide rod that you have is going to depend on how you do it. This Kimber that I'm showing you has a toolless guide rod that is a twist push guide rod that is toolless. So I push the guide rod forward, twist push, and I can pull the spring out. Bull barrel guns are going to push straight out the front of the barrel, and that's super nice. The gun is fully apart. So first thing I do is I take a paper towel. I use 2 paper towels when I clean a gun, and I go through it and I wipe everything down and get as much of it as I can with just that paper towel. And honestly, that's pretty good. Like, you could stop right there and just oil the gun and go back to it. But if I'm going a little bit deeper, then I use these triangle shaped Q-tips. Apparently these are used in beauty. 2 gals that I shoot with introduced me to triangle Q-tips, and they are absolutely great for cleaning guns. I'll put an Amazon link in the description so you don't have to ask. But the triangle tipped Q-tips are fantastic for cleaning guns. So next step is I will soak those bad boys in some gun solvent, and in this case I'm using the modern Spartan systems, but I use Hoppies, I use the True Blue, I use whatever is handy. There's plenty of stuff you can use. So I'll get that on the Q-tips, and I will go through and I'll get in all the nooks and crannies, paying particular attention to where the gun is in friction. So the areas where metal is sliding against metal, I pay the most attention to. It's going to be your locking lugs. It's going to be the slide channel inside the slide where the rails ride, the rails themselves, and the bottom of the slide. I get all that real clean with the solvent and Q-tips. The barrel I wipe down, but there's always some build up on the barrel, so I'll hit it more with some solvent. Sometimes I get the brush, sometimes I have to get the nylon pick out and scrape off the buildup from the carbon. I finish off with a Q-tip to the locking lugs to make sure they're about as clean as I can get them. Jumping over onto the frame, I'm paying attention to the rails, the ejector, and the disconnector. That's really what I'm paying attention to. I'll wipe out the inside of the dust cover, but it doesn't really affect how the gun runs. Then I'll take the Q-tips and I'll hit them on the rails and really do a good job getting all that carbon off. If there's buildup on the front two rails, which there usually is, then I'll use the nylon brush to get that off. Then it comes time to oil the gun. If you haven't figured this out by now, I go through probably 6 or so Q-tips every time I clean a gun. But I will get the oil onto a clean Q-tip and run it through the channel inside the slide. I'll then go to the other areas inside the slide and coat it with a little bit of oil just to act as a barrier so it cleans up easier next time I have the gun apart. I'll get into some grease sometimes. I'm using grease just because, you know, this is a video. So using the grease, just putting it on these slide lugs, just kind of painting it in there, both on the barrel and on the slide. I'll take some oil to the barrel. I'll, you know, put a thin coat around the front of the barrel where it locks up with the slide when it's in battery. I'll put a little barrier on the feed ramp simply to try and keep the carbon from building up there because feed ramps tend to accumulate carbon. Moving over to the frame, I'll paint some oil onto all 4 of the slide rails, or 2 if it's a Bull Armory gun, just to make sure that I have maximum coating. I'll put some on the disconnector. I'll paint some on the side of the ejector as well, just to act as a barrier again. And since we have the gun apart and it's roughly time for that, I'll replace the recoil spring. And so I'm replacing the recoil spring, and while we're at it, I will replace the firing pin spring. Since firing pin springs come with recoil springs, every other one or so, I'll just swap the firing pin spring to make sure that spring doesn't wear out. And one thing that you're going to want to do is, if you have an internal extractor about every 2,000 to 3,000 rounds on an open gun, you're going to want to pull the extractor and clean the channel with a 22 bore jag. And on the minor guns, if you have an internal extractor, it's maybe every 5,000 to 10,000 rounds, you're going to want to do the same thing. When extractors lose tension, the ejection of the cases gets all kind of erratic. And so what is often referred to as the tune of the extractor going out, more often than not, what that really means is there's buildup inside the extractor channel, and that is what is keeping the adjustment of the extractor off. If you keep that channel clean, generally you don't have to tune your extractor, but it can be something that needs to be looked after. Putting the gun back together is the reverse. You seat the barrel in the slide, you seat the recoil spring assembly back in the gun as well. Move the slide onto the frame and then use some kind of tool to get the link to line up with the hole in the frame to get your slide stop in. You push it in most of the way so it grabs the slide lock, and then you move the slide further to the rear and push the slide lock in through the little half moon cutout, same as you took it apart the first time. And voila, the gun is put back together. So we talked about changing out some parts, and this is probably going to be your #1 thing for maintenance. The #1 thing that wears out on 2011 pistols is going to be your recoil spring. They can get about 5,000 rounds on a recoil spring, and then you're going to have to swap it. If you overspring your guns, you don't have to swap every 5,000 rounds. You can go maybe twice as long, but just realize if you've got it kind of set up to the sweet spot for the gun, they're going to make it about 5,000 rounds. So that's the #1 spring that you're going to have to stay on top of. #2, as I mentioned, the firing pin spring. I tend to swap this every other go with the recoil spring. I'll swap the firing pin spring. And the reason you do that, if you think about it, the firing pin spring pushes the base of the firing pin out the back of the gun for the hammer to hit. And if that spring wears out and gets compressed, it's presenting less of the firing pin, which means you're more likely to get light strikes. So if you're getting light strikes, that's a good place to start, is swap that spring and see if you still get them. The next place is check the firing pin to make sure it's not deformed or visibly shorter than what it should be. You can kind of tell when you get that way. But a firing pin is something that does get replaced on an interval as well, but you know, it's going to be closer to like 20, 25,000 rounds when it makes sense to get a new firing pin. There's 2 other springs in the gun that you can change, but like realistically, one's a 20 to 25,000 round spring. That is your main spring, or the hammer spring. That is located inside the main spring housing at the base of the grip, and it is encapsulated on either end by a plug and this little insert. I don't know what it's called. It's like a little arrow looking thing at the bottom. The other spring is your sear spring or leaf spring, and it is inside behind that main spring housing. I have heard of somebody breaking a leg on their sear spring through use, although I've never seen it happen, and I've only heard of it happening one time. I'll let people who are more experienced than me weigh in on the change interval for the sear spring, but I think they're good for quite a long time. The number one thing that is going to break on your 2011 pistol, it's no different from any other pistol, is honestly your optic screws. People think that the fasteners securing your optic to the gun or the plate to the gun are these parts that are just going to last indefinitely. They are not. And about once annually, when you change out the battery on your optic, it's not a bad idea to go ahead and get some new screws, clean the threads with alcohol, let it dry all the way, apply your Loctite 243 thread locker, which is something you didn't know existed until probably right now. And Loctite 243 is a higher heat resistant version than Loctite 242, which is what typically is on sale in hardware stores. You probably have to order this off the internet, and I'm telling you, this will stand up to, like, if you've got like really intense training sessions where you're basically mag dumping for, you know, half an hour because you're running rounds up on the gun. Loctite 243 will stand up to that. 242 tends to not. It gets defeated by the heat that generates. But you don't want to replace those stupid little screws because yours haven't broke yet. Yes, everyone says that until they break them. So yeah, take note of what thread pitch you need and what length screw you need and order replacement screws. You can buy them in bulk from a place like McMaster Car. If you don't know what screws you need or have, you can go to Siley Optics. They have an anything and everything screw pack, which is kind of, I've used this to collect all the extra screws from all the optics I've gone through on the channel here, but they've got loads and loads of different optic thread pitches and different lengths of screws, and you can pretty much find what you need in that pack, and it's only like 15 bucks. Another cautionary tale, and I don't have one of these guns out, but some guns are coming with two-piece guide rods. If your 2011 comes with a two-piece guide rod, run to a store that sells one-piece guide rods and get one of those. This Bull Armory doesn't have a two-piece guide rod, but what happens with a two-piece guide rod is basically you lock the slide to the rear, you put the Allen key in the nose of the guide rod, and you loosen it part of the way. You take the slide stop out, take the slide off the gun, and loosen it the rest of the way. And that's how you take apart a two-piece guide rod. The problem is that when you do that, you are then putting the trust that you have tightened that guide rod all the way down to the test, because what can happen is the guide rod is going to unscrew a little bit as the gun is fired, and eventually the springs will bind on that two-piece guide rod. It's a terrible design, and no modern manufacturer, I'm looking at you Springfield and Alpha Foxtrot, should be using two-piece guide rods, yet here we are. If you need to get a new guide rod for your gun, then the one-piece guide rod's always great, comes apart with a staple. If you don't want to use the staple, then Atlas Gun Works, Dawson Precision, and Kimber all make different toolless guide rod options. A toolless guide rod is a mega quality of life upgrade. I would highly recommend it. So what are the big fat fails that 2011s tend to have? What are the Achilles heel of the platform? The first I mentioned is going to be the guide rod. If you've got a two-piece guide rod, that is the number one fail point. Number two fail point is always a software thing. It's when new shooters get a single action only gun and they try to let their thumb ride not on the safety paddle. What ends up happening is the gun will cycle, they'll bump the safety up, and then they'll choke the gun and it'll get a feeding issue. I have seen a man who shot his entire law enforcement career try and shoot a single action only gun in an IDPA match and choke the gun to death because he refused to keep his thumb on the single action only paddle. You have to ride your thumb on the safety for the gun. You have to. There's only one right way to do it. It's this way. There are not just as good ways. This is it. This is how you ride your thumb on a single action only gun. You just keep your thumb on that safety and life is good. Conversely, when you need the safety to be applied, you put your thumb underneath it with continuous upward pressure. So if you're doing administrative gun handling, you have your thumb under the safety applying upward pressure. That's how the things work. Then the next most common is if you do have your thumb on the paddle like you're supposed to, you're bearing your knuckle into the slide, so when the slide cycles, your thumb is pushing into those rear serrations, and they are, you can actually, no, this gun's been cleaned. You can actually see the skin accumulation on this Bull Armory from when I was shooting it, but my buddy borrowed it and cleaned it and gave it back to me, so the skin's not there. But if you're bearing into the slide of the gun, especially if it's got a lighter recoil spring, like this is a ported gun, so it's got a lighter recoil spring, you're gonna wanna keep that thumb away from the slide because the lighter recoil springs will choke sooner than heavier recoil spring guns. And if that's just not an option for you, then get some shielded safeties. This Bullet Armory Spitfire has shielded safeties so that no matter how I try, my thumb can never interfere with the slide moving. It just moves back and forth without me being able to mess with it. So shielded safeties are fantastic. I highly recommend them, especially for ported and compensated guns. Major fails as far as the guns actually breaking, there's two to kind of look out for. And the first is due to an improperly fit barrel, and that is slide cracking. So where the slide is generally going to crack is right here at the back of the ejection port running down. That's the weakest point on the slide. And the reason for that is if you think about how a 1911 barrel unlocks from the slide, it's basically trying to break itself in half like this every time it unlocks, and eventually sometimes there can be cracks right there. It's not as common on minor guns. If you're shooting like regular off-the-shelf 9mm, it's not going to happen as much. It's definitely common in 9mm major open guns like Mr. Spitfire over here, although I've never had a Bullet Armory slide crack. So that's one big fat fail. The other big fat fail is the frames can crack, and usually it is somewhere around the hole for the slide stop in the frame. That's where the crack tends to develop if it's going to crack. It's less common than the slide cracking, but it does happen from time to time. But these are usually pretty high round count guns. Although some people who have been shooting open guns from a large brand that you may recognize went through a lot of slides cracking. There is a brand that is a premium brand that have cracked a lot of slides, and they don't make open guns anymore. So there's that. And then a less serious issue, because these single action only triggers have a over travel adjustment in the face of the trigger. People will set these up so that there is no over travel when the trigger is pulled, and as a result, what ends up happening is you get hammer follow, meaning that you pull the trigger, slide goes forward, and the hammer stays down. And if that happens, usually the fix is simply introduce a little bit more over travel and the problem will go away. Now, there can be problems with the sear and hammer engagement that cause hammer follow, and that is entirely different from what you typically encounter, but that's usually the number one suspect if you're getting hammer follow. Another thing to look out for is going to be your failure to feed. If you're getting failures to feed, the first thing to check for is that your thumb isn't riding the slide on the safety. That's number one. But number two, you're going to want to mark that magazine. This is going to happen more commonly in guns that are dry fired a lot and you're using dry fire mags at the range, or you are stepping on mags that you're dropping mags and stepping on them. What can happen is you can compress or spread the feed lips so that the rounds don't feed correctly, and that is an issue with the 2011 magazine, which is why everyone's playing with all these other magazines for 9mm guns, because a 9mm 2011 mag is effectively built around 45 geometry, which makes no sense. So, you know, a proper 9mm geometry won't have as much issues with feed lips. So if you have a magazine that you're getting fails to feed with, just mark that magazine and then get home and take calipers and measure it, and you can kind of bash the magazine feed lips back into tolerance as you need to. That is less common now than it used to be 10 years ago in the competitive shooting scene. We saw that kind of, oh, your feed lips aren't an adjustment or whatever. That doesn't happen a lot. It's happened to me in a match when I only had, you know, one open gun and I was shooting open. I only had 4 magazines, so I dry fired with magazines, and through, you know, reloading into an open gun, which weighs like 50 something ounces, you know, you're crashing that magazine into the back of the mag well, and eventually the feed lips just pinch together and start to create issues. And that happened to me in Area 4 in I think 2020 or 2021. So the solution to that is simply develop one magazine that you're going to use as your dry fire magazine. That's great. Double Alpha makes inert magazines, which are good for dry fire. Other issues you typically will see are based around reloading. So if you reload for a 2011, since there is no like agreed upon standard for how the barrels are supposed to be reamed on their throats, they have different lengths that they will take. For instance, this Bullet Armory can take loads that are out to like a 1.180, no problem in 9mm. Whereas this Kimber with that same projectile will need to be at like a 1.130. So if you're reloading, you are gonna have to measure the projectile in the chamber of the gun you're loading to. Just because it works in one gun doesn't mean it's necessarily going to work in the other guns. And finally, as far as cleaning ports and compensators, like look how clean that barrel is. Look at that. Aren't you jealous how clean my barrel is? And now you're gonna be like, hey, tell me how to get my ported barrel to look that good. And the answer to that is make a friend who has an ultrasonic cleaner that cleans with oil, because that's what happened. My buddy Danny borrowed this gun. He's got one of those. When he was done with it, he threw the barrel in the ultrasonic and cleaned it up, and it came out much, much nicer. But what I tend to do with the ported barrels is I'll just take a pick and just pick at the surface of the barrel after I apply some of that gun scrubber to it and try to get it off. That's another pro tip. Gun scrubber is some pretty noxious stuff, but it works really well if you're in a bind and need to go quick. It's under pressure, so you're gonna wanna do it outside, but at the same time, like, good grief, does that stuff make a mess. But if you need a gun cleaned in a hurry, gun scrubber does a good job while polluting the environment in an incredible manner. I don't use it unless I absolutely have to, but it is an option if you need to clean a gun really quickly. Compensators are no different. Compensators, you know, you have to pick out, or you can get like a brush attachment for your Dremel and take that to the inside. But the number one trick to keeping your barrels and compensators clean on ported guns and comped guns is going to be not use synthetic jacketed bullets. You cannot use those and expect to have the gun stay clean. First year I shot open, I put like, I don't know, 15,000 rounds of synthetic jacketed bullets through the gun, and the compensator was filled with that coating. It comes off every time the gun is fired. It makes a huge mess. It's very difficult to get out of the expansion chambers. Simply don't do it. It's not worth saving the money. If you think about how much you save versus jacketed bullets in a given year, the hassle of cleaning that gunk out of your compensator is easily worth the delta. I can promise you that. I have paid this stupid tax. You don't need to do it. It's just, don't do it. Don't save that money on those stupid bullets. Just get regular bullets. So it's not really rocket surgery. I mean, clean the gun every 2 or 3 times the range, or about 1,000 rounds, whichever comes first. And then, you know, just keep on top of the spring changes. Keep a log for when the spring changes need to be done, and life will be good. The guns will be pretty much bulletproof for you if you can keep to that kind of maintenance schedule. If you got any favorite 2011 tips or tricks, be sure and share them in the comments. If you know when you're supposed to change sear springs, you can leave that in the comments too. As always, I appreciate you guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.